Good afternoon. This year not only marks our 22nd Past Summit Conference, but today we are celebrating the 18th Women in Technology Keynote, formerly the luncheon, at Past Virtual Summit. It is my pleasure to welcome all our virtual attendees, and I also want to say hello to everyone watching this live stream on Past TV. I'd like to start off by thanking returning sponsor SentryOne for supporting the event again this year. It's been amazing to watch our WIT keynotes grow over the years, and today we welcome women leaders in technology and supporters across the world in this virtual setting. To everyone who has contributed to the success of WIT initiatives throughout the years, thank you. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce our WIT keynote speaker, my friend and former past board member, Denise McInerney. Denise is a data professional with over 20 years of experience. She began her career as a database administrator and has worked as a data analyst and a data engineer. She now works as a data architect at Intuit, where she designs and implements analytics solutions that enable the organization to use data to improve its products and better serve customers. Denise is active in technical community organizations and has spoken at user groups and conferences over 30 times. She was recently included in a list of 12 inspiring female architects in software and data. Denise has been a passionate proponent of advancing the cause of women in technology for over 15 years. She has organized events, spoken and written on the topic, and was a founding member of the Past Women in Technology group. Denise served 6 years on the Past Board of Directors, where she drove the adoption of an anti-harassment policy for the organization. Denise has volunteered her time today to speak to you about the evolution of the WIT movement within PASS and the role we all play in breaking down the barriers that face women in technology. Please join me in welcoming Denise McInerney.
Thank you for that introduction, Wendy, and thank you all for joining the Past Women in Technology keynote at Past Summit 2020. As Wendy said, my name is Denise McInerney, and I'm really thrilled to be here with you today. I have been a data professional for over 20 years. I was a database administrator, and I've had several other roles in the data space. Currently, I am an architect at Intuit, where I build analytics solutions. I've also been active in PASS for many years, and I spent 6 years serving on the board of directors. I was a founding member of the Past Women in Technology group, and I've also been active in WIT initiatives both inside my company and in the industry. We want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, SentryOne. SentryOne has been a supporter and sponsor of WIT events at Past Summit for many years, and we're so appreciative to have your support again this year. So today, we're going to take a little look back at the history of WIT in PASS. We're going to put that in some context of what has been happening in the industry as a whole. We'll look at the progress that's been made and the work that is left to do and how we can all be part of the solution of the challenges that women in technology face. So let's start looking back at WIT at Past Summit. This is actually the 18th WIT event at Past Summit. And when we started, the objectives were pretty straightforward. First, we were looking to start having the conversation about the challenges for women in tech in the PASS community. We were also looking to increase the participation of women in the organization, and especially to encourage more women to step forward and become speakers for PASS. So the first WIT event was in 2003, and I should say for every year, it has been a PASS WIT luncheon and panel or keynote. Obviously, we have no official luncheon this year, so I hope wherever you are, you have some refreshments or some snacks so you can pretend as if we are all together in a big room having a luncheon. So 2003 was the first year. We had a panel of speakers, and actually we had panels every year through 2013. In 2014, we started inviting external speakers. We had a couple of fireside chats, and we've also had external speakers present keynotes. And in that time, from 2003 until last year, the attendance at Past WIT events grew from 65 that first year to over 800 in the last couple of years. So a tremendous amount of interest and support from the community in the intervening time. So what did we talk about at all these luncheons? Well, we really covered a range of topics affecting women in tech. Several years we covered leadership and professional development type topics, how to ask for what you need at work, how to develop women as leaders. We also talked about how to increase the number of women in tech in general. We had some focus on how to increase the interest of girls and young women in studying computer science, and how to continue to develop them through college and in industry. And we also covered some of the challenges that face women, like the communication gaps that we can experience. So pretty big range of topics that we talked about that covered that interest. In all, we had over 60 speakers at past WIT events. So I mentioned that for 11 years we had panels. So these are all the people who participated in one or sometimes more than one panel in those years. I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who gave their time and energy to help make the past WIT events at Summit happen. You may recognize a number of the names on this list, either as people maybe who are presenting at past Summit this year or have in previous years, or who you recognize as leaders in past in different ways. So thank you all for the contributions you made in those years. Now, in addition to the panels I mentioned, we started inviting external speakers. We've had a really impressive array, beginning with Kimberly Bryant, who's the founder of Black Girls Code. We also had Angie Chang, who at the time was a VP of Hackbright Academy, which is an organization that had boot camps for women to learn computer science. She also founded Girl Geek X. So Angie is quite an activist in the WIT space. We hosted Kelly Primus, who's the CEO of a women's leadership development organization. Heather Ritchie, who is an executive head of marketing at Nokia, who talked about some of the challenges facing women as they go up the ranks and the communication skills that they need to develop. We also had Lori Bingham. Lori's a senior director at T-Mobile, and she told us the story of how women at T-Mobile organized a grassroots interest group within the organization to help promote and advance their interests and their careers. And finally, last year we had Lashonna Lewis. Lashonna is the CEO of LM Lewis Consulting, and she talked to us about the importance of data in attaining diversity and how we as data professionals can all be part of that. So quite a range of speakers and topics. So here's how we grew. I mentioned 65 to 800. I couldn't find a photo of the 65, but this photo from 2006, this was about 130 people. And then the picture from 2017 is, as you can see, 700 or 800 folks in the keynote room. By then, we had to take over the large keynote room at Past Summit because no other room could hold it. So this is kind of fun to see how much we grew in pictures. So let's take a look at all of the things that happened around and in Past WIT, from that first luncheon in 2003. So in 2005, what was called then a special interest group, they're now known as virtual groups, but the Past WIT special interest group was formed. And that was a first grassroots effort to have more activities for women in PASS in addition to the luncheon. In those early days, the luncheons, as you saw, were pretty small, and there was sort of an attitude that it was just for women, or that it wasn't really open to other people, which was never true, but we didn't have a lot of support or attendance from men at PASS in those early years. That really changed in 2006, when Kevin Klein, who was president of PASS at the time, from the keynote stage at PASS Summit, invited everyone to attend and said that he was going to attend the Past WIT luncheon. And that was really the watershed for when we started to get a lot more interest and attention from attendees in general at PASS. And 2006 was actually the year we ran out of chairs in the luncheon room and people were standing and leaning against the wall. So in 2009, again, we were getting a lot of support from the community, and we started to get support from our vendor partners. So in 2009, the first sponsor of the Past WIT luncheon was Computer Associates. GoDaddy sponsored 1 year, and then SQL Sentry has actually been sponsoring the WIT luncheon since 2011. And as I mentioned, they're again supporting us this year. So we're very appreciative to all of the sponsors who have seen the importance of WIT at PASS and have stepped up to help us. Now in 2010, WIT activities expanded beyond Past Summit to SQL Saturdays. SQL Saturdays, of course, take place around the world, and a lot of people attend SQL Saturdays who may not have had a chance to come to a Past Summit. And so it was great to see the SQL Saturdays organizers begin to offer and support Past WIT activities. Now, I mentioned one of our goals was to increase the number of speakers, and that was pretty slow going. Now, in 2011, we had an all-female lineup for 24 hours of PASS. And this was an opportunity for more women to step forward as speakers, to become known as speakers at this virtual event. And that was another time where we really saw a little bit of a breakthrough in terms of people participating. Now, in 2012, that was when PASS adopted an anti-harassment policy. There had been a bit of discussion in the preceding years in the industry as a whole. There had been incidents of sexual harassment and even sexual assault at some technical conferences. And many women in the industry were really demanding that organizations do the right thing and have a way to address these behaviors that were unacceptable. And PASS, we recognize that if we really wanted to be a welcoming and inclusive place, we should also provide those protections. Of course, the anti-harassment policy covers harassment of all forms, does not just protect women, but this was an important step forward. Now, I should say that these were not the easiest discussions, because to propose that you are going to have an anti-harassment policy was to admit that everything wasn't, all peaches and cream. So we had some hard discussions in the board. I was actually on the board at that time, and some difficult discussions in the community. But at the end of the day, everyone recognized that this was an important step to take for the organization. Now, in 2015, the Women in Tech virtual group, which had continued to grow, started launching their own webinars. And I think what the WIT group has done has really been great, because the webinars have been on topics affecting women in technology, but they've also played a big role in encouraging women to present at other virtual groups, be it on cloud or DBA or analytics. And that, again, has been another way for more women to develop their speaking skills. Now, in 2016, after a few years, we recognized the need to expand the anti-harassment policy. And this was really based on people recognizing that there were ways that we need to be able to address potential issues. So in 2016, our vendor partners actually all adopted the anti-harassment policy to cover events that they sponsored. And that was also the year that PASS made it possible for SQL Saturday organizers to have an anti-harassment policy if they chose. So we provided a framework for that and the language for that. So I think these were important steps and important messages for the community as a whole. And then the most recent event in this space would be the launching of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion virtual group, which of course just launched this year. So many things happened as we just described. So let's take a look at what the impact was in terms of participation of women at PASS. So there was not official data collection in the early years, but I can tell you, as someone who was at PASS Summit in 2002, 2003, that there was a pretty low participation of women. I can tell you that I'd be in a session room and maybe I'd be the only woman there, or maybe there'd be one other. Or I'd look across the dining hall and I'd have to skip over 3 or 4 tables before I'd find a table where there was another woman sitting. That's not true today, which is pretty exciting. And as you can see from the slide, the last several years, that summit attendance has grown a little bit, and we've really topped out right around 20%, which is good progress, certainly from those early days. Similarly, speakers at Summit, again, my unofficial data collection tells me that in the early years before 2006, 2007, speakers hovered right around 10 or 11%, and this was just me going through the program counting, right around 10, 11% female. And that's really grown quite a bit, and to where we're up to, again, about 20% women speaking at PASS Summit last year. So progress on all fronts there. Now let's take a look at SQL Saturday, because of course SQL Saturdays are a place where speakers, new speakers start out often, user groups, SQL Saturdays, those kinds of events. And I thank the PASS WIT group for keeping good track of this. And you can see the number of sessions given by women at SQL Saturdays the last few years, and a pretty good growth over the last couple of years, 11% each year. So we have seen a lot of women stepping up and taking on the challenges and learning to use their voice and share their knowledge with the community, which is great to see. So if we look back at the objectives, having the conversation, getting more women to participate, increasing the number of women speakers. I think we've made progress on all these fronts. There's always more progress to make, but certainly things are further along now than when PassWIT first started 18 years ago. And if you look at today's PASS, right, our current board of directors, the elected members of the board, 4 of them are women. Or the Passion Award winners. Many women step up to volunteer and PASS in different ways. And actually going back to 2006, 50% of the Passion Award winners were women. So those are other reflections of the kinds of roles that women play in PASS, in its leadership and its growth. And I would say overall, by having the discussion in the community, by being honest about the issues that people were facing, by doing things like having the anti-harassment policy, PASS has made it clear that women are included and women are welcome in this organization. All right, so let's take a look at what was happening in the industry in these similar years, because of course, PASS does not exist in a vacuum, right? We all work for companies. We're all involved in the technology industry in a larger sense. So I have some data from 2007, which was close to when PassWIT started. And in the US, 25% of computing jobs were held by women. And as you can see from the slide, pretty small percentage of for women of color altogether. So that was the context from an industry perspective. Now, a good measure or one thing, the metric that's good to watch is the percentage of women in computer science programs and graduating with computer science degrees. Again, these are US statistics. And there's a stat you'll hear a lot in women in tech space that the high point of women in tech, in the US at least, was in the mid-1980s. And that was the highest proportion of women getting CS degrees, around 35% in the mid-80s. And as you can see from the slope, it declined. And by the time PassWIT started in 2003, it was around 24%. And this decline was definitely being observed. It was very concerning for people who wanted to advance the cause of women in technology. And so that was another input, another context to PassWIT's environment. So this graph actually starts at 2003, and I pulled a few particular job roles so you can see the proportion of women. That top line is actually DBAs, which has always been an interesting trend line for me to keep an eye on. So when PassWIT started, according to the US government at least, 40% of DBAs in the US were women. Now, we weren't seeing 40% of attendees at PASS Summit were women, so that was another thing we sort of like, if there's a lot more women in the industry, how can we attract them more to PASS? And then, of course, other job roles, that blue line is software engineers, which of course is a large proportion of technology jobs. And it's been, hovering in the mid-20s, and it was around 25% when we started. The red line is network and systems administrators. Again, just a little bit above 20% when we started. So that sort of gives you the context for what was happening in the industry overall in terms of women's participation. Now, I picked out some key events that I wanted to speak to here because I think they're important in thinking about the context of what's happened in the more recent years. But first, just going back a little bit. So the height of women's participation in computing was the mid to late 1980s, and women were organizing that time. There were different groups, advocacy groups, networking groups that came together in the late 80s, early 90s. And the first Grace Hopper conference was actually held in 1994, and it's been held just about every year since then. The most recent Grace Hopper celebration of women in computing had 30,000 people attend virtually just a few weeks ago. So Grace Hopper has been an important touchstone, I think, important thing to watch in terms of trends for especially women in computing, women in college in computing. Now, I mentioned PASS's anti-harassment policy, and I mentioned that there have been some incidents previous to within the industry at conferences. And in 2011, actually, a pretty significant conference, OSCON, Open Source Conference, adopted an anti-harassment policy or code of conduct. Unfortunately, that was in response to some things that had occurred at a previous event, and really the demands of women in that community that OSCON not just stand by, that they do something. But it was an important domino because a number of other conferences followed suit. And that's a good thing. Not a good thing that these incidents occur, but it's a good thing that there's a framework for dealing with them when they do occur and for sending a message that they're not acceptable. Now, in 2012, there was a fairly famous lawsuit. Ellen Pao sued Kleiner Perkins, a venture capital firm, for gender discrimination. That suit actually didn't come to trial for a few years, but it exposed a lot of the experience of women in the VC world. And so it's an important touchstone, I think, in the last several years. In 2013, a software engineer by the name of Tracy Chow, she was, I believe, at Pinterest at the time, she published a blog post on Medium calling on companies to release their diversity data. It was actually interesting. Up until that point, the only data that was collected by the US or by the government, and therefore was aggregated, right? So you could tell, I could tell you that 25% of all computing jobs in the US were held by women, but I couldn't know anything about individual companies. So, and it was apparent, especially in sort of the startup world or in some of the Silicon Valley companies, that the proportion of women seemed pretty low. So Tracy published this blog and said, hey, where are the numbers? And there were some crowdsourcing efforts actually to try to figure that out, much like me figuring out that 10% of past speakers were women by going through the program. But in 2014, big tech companies actually started publishing their statistics officially. And that was an important moment because it gave visibility into what was actually happening. Now, as they published these numbers, they would pledge they would do better. These aren't good enough. We want to do better. We will invest more. Again, an important message. Happened only about 6 years ago, but still an important message. Now, 2014 also was the year that the Gamergate harassment campaign started. Gamergate is another one of those watershed moments in the last decade that really exposed some of the ugliness for the experience of women in tech, in this case, in the gaming world. But this harassment was very public. It happened on social media and then actually happened in real life. There were some very serious threats, stalking, threats of death, threats of rape that happened directed at women who objected to maybe how women were portrayed in some games, or the fact that women were running gaming companies of their own. And I bring this up because I think it's important to sort of recognize the experience of many women in many areas of technology, right? And Gamergate really exposed a very ugly side that is part of many women's reality if they want to work in tech. Similarly, in 2017, an engineer named Susan Fowler, who had just left Uber, published a blog post that garnered a huge amount of attention. Her blog post was about her experience and the experience of other women at Uber and their experience with sexual harassment, inequitable treatment, and just a general culture of hostility and exclusion. And that blog post triggered a lot of changes at Uber eventually, and also triggered a lot of other women to come forward and talk about their experience at that company and others, which was also similar. Uber at the time, right, was seen as this pinnacle, this unicorn. The valuation was so high, they were growing so fast. They were getting a tremendous amount of attention, and of course, a tremendous amount of investment. And so the fact that this was exposed, this side of the company was exposed, was actually a very important contribution that Susan and the other women who came forward made. 2017, a lot of things happened in 2017. 2017 was also the year that a number of serious allegations of both sexual harassment and sexual assault were leveled against some prominent venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. And this was a bit of a pattern that got exposed. And as women started to come forward, more women came forward. And one of the things we learned through this was that a lot of women had been forced to sign or really had no choice but to sign non-disclosure agreements. So a lot of things that happened had gotten sort of swept under the rug with the signing of an NDA. And so these more egregious activities had been taking place. These people, some of these VCs were very prominent. They were heading up funds that controlled a lot of investment. And of course, VCs are an important part of any startup getting off the ground. So if women are experiencing hostility or sexual harassment within the VC firms or in dealing with the VC firms, you can imagine how little support female founders would be getting from these same VCs. So there was a lot to this particular story that exposed a lot of what was happening in Silicon Valley. Again, very important. Another thing in 2017 was really a watershed, was the publication by an engineer at he was at Google at the time, named James Damore. He was published a memo. Well, he wrote it internally, but eventually it became public. And it was in reaction to anti-diversity efforts within Google. And it was somewhat hostile to those anti-diversity efforts. And as part of writing that, he made some statements about the fitness or lack of fitness for women in technology. And of course, this got a lot of attention as well on both sides. Not everyone condemned his point of view. There were actually a number of people who agreed with him. And I thought I'd call this out because it's important to recognize that not everyone in tech believes that there should be equity or inclusion across the board. And there is a school of thought within the technology space that believes that actually women don't belong. Underrepresented groups don't belong. Now, of course, Me Too also happened in 2017, and that was not directly related to the technology sector, but again, it exposed the experience of women across the board in many sectors, and also encouraged or supported women in stepping forward, right? Many women are not believed when they talk about these things, and that has really changed with Me Too in many ways, and also exposed sort of the insidiousness of these non-disclosure agreements, which so many of these incidents have been covered over. So I think it's important to think about the experience of women in tech in the context of the experience of women in general, and Me Too certainly addresses part of that. And then maybe more of a positive note, in 2019, Intel was the first large company to release their data on salary discrepancies based on gender or race. And that was only last year, right? And it was great that they did it, and other companies have followed suit, but it was a very recent development. So if you look at all of this in the aggregate, especially this last decade, right? What does this show us? Well, it tells us a lot about the environment that women have worked in technology, but it shines a light on things that really need to be addressed. And unless problems are exposed and daylight is shown upon them, you cannot fix these problems. So keep this whole picture in mind as we talk about and take a look at the statistics of women in tech today. So first, looking at academia in the United States, right now about 21% of computer science bachelor's degrees are awarded to women. And as you can see, the percentage of women of color receiving CS degrees is quite small in many cases. I had to go out to 2 decimal points, to 2 decimal places so that you could see what the participation was. So that's very concerning across the board. And that overall percentage has not really moved a whole lot. We're certainly not up to that 35% we had in the late 80s that we talked about earlier. It's trending up a little bit. And now if we take a look at industry, so the percentage of computing jobs held by women today is 26% in the US. And that's a pretty modest growth from 2007. And as you can see, the growth for women of color also modest to almost non-existent. So the good news is you can now find data where these things are broken out by race, so you can really see what is happening. Companies who've published their data also break it out by race as well as gender. So again, important to measure what's happening so that we can fix it. And the data collection happens everywhere. So I just pulled a sampling of countries just to see how different or similar things were. And you can see there's a pretty big range, and nobody sort of breaks that 30% mark, but some countries are getting closer to that. And I would encourage you, if you live in somewhere other than one of these countries I've been talking about the data in, to do a little research, because I bet you can find these statistics for where you live and understand the environment that you're at personally in. Now let's take a look at some of these big tech companies who started to share in 5 or 6 years ago what their numbers were, and with their pledges and investment to do better, how have they really done? There's been growth in some cases, modest growth, but you can see sort of where they stand. This is all incremental, right? None of this is really trajectory changing kinds of growth. But you can see all of these things, whether you look at it by country, where you look at it by company, all sort of in the same range. Okay, so it's modest progress at best, right? What's going on? Why? With all of this investment, with all of this attention, why are those numbers not moving more? Well, I would submit that what's going well is early career hiring. I think companies really are doing a much better job of recruiting and hiring young women out of college or in the early years of their career. What's not going well is pretty much everything else. So mid and senior level hiring, very slow. Retention and advancement, also not going well. And let's take a look at some of that data. The sad fact is that women leave tech at an astonishing rate, actually. Over 50% of women leave tech at the mid-career point, which is considered 10 or 15 years. And they leave tech at twice the rate that men leave tech. And almost a third of women say that they feel their careers are stalled in technology. Take a look at those trend lines, right, on the chart on the right. The yellow line is professions that are not considered STEM. STEM is science, technology, engineering, and math. So all of those technical related careers. So yellow line is non-STEM, the green line is STEM. And the x-axis is tenure in years, and the y-axis is retention rate. And you can see the drastic difference in those curves. So as women continue to, their tenure increases in STEM, the retention rate decreases pretty dramatically. Whereas in other professional careers that are not related to STEM, the retention rate is much better. So there's definitely something happening here. There's a lot of churn. And another thing to just keep our eyes on as we move forward is there's been some studies, very recent studies since the coronavirus pandemic started, at the rate at which women are leaving the workforce in general, across all sectors. And there's some real concerns. McKinsey and Lean In just released a study. There's some real concerns that a lot of the gains that women have made across the board in the workforce are going to be eroded. We'll see over time what this means in the technology space specifically, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on. So why this huge churn? Why do 50% of women leave tech by the mid-career point? There's actually a lot of factors that go into that, and that's what we want to take a little time to look at now. So the first category of things is what you might call workplace issues, right? So managerial support, lack of managerial support, lack of role models, lack of sponsors and mentors, all the things that are needed to advance your career. And a lot of small biases in daily interactions with coworkers, with colleagues, with management, which you might call the death by 1,000 cuts experience. Women also cite a lack of real opportunities, interesting work, more creative work, more innovative work. Women note that they often get sort of relegated to execution roles because, hey, we're really good at them. And that may be true, but that's not usually the career trajectory type of work that really moves you forward. And in general, women cite dissatisfaction with the prospects in their career. They see that they're promoted at slower rates. The data bears that out for sure. And women are much more likely to experience what's called the personality penalty, the feedback that says you're too abrasive, you're too aggressive. The feedback is much more about style than it is about substance, performance, technical skills. There's again been quite a bit of study done of this. Women are much more likely in the review process to get feedback about their personality or their style as opposed to their work product. It doesn't happen to men at nearly that rate. So think about this, all of this, the experience of women in the workplace, and think about what we talked about a few minutes ago about the overall events in the industry and how those two things may in fact come together to produce this environment. Not everyone really believes that women and underrepresented folks have a place in the industry, and that is borne out in many people's experience day to day. Now, I do want to take a minute to recognize and acknowledge the fact that the experience of women in technology is not a homogeneous one, right? There are certainly commonalities, but there are many factors that impact people's experience in the industry and in the world. We are multidimensional. So women of an underrepresented race, or if your sexual orientation, your country of origin, your gender identity, all of these things come into play. And all of the problems we talked about a minute ago in terms of the challenges for women, the reasons why they leave, those things are just exacerbated when we talk about folks of underrepresented groups. The lack of role models, the biases people deal with, the lack of sponsors, the lack of mentors, all of those things are just underscored and harder to overcome. And so when we think about solutions, we need to keep in mind that this women in tech space is not a monolithic thing, right? And so the word you'll hear sometimes is intersectionality. It's recognizing that different life experiences and perspectives all come into play. And so when we're thinking about solutions to some of these problems, we need to keep all of that in mind. The thing is, these problems are fixable, right? So let's take a minute to look at how we can actually address some of the things. And let's start with recruitment, all right? So if you want to recruit more people who are not represented in your industry, you have to change how you recruit. So start with your job posting language. Look critically at how you're writing your job descriptions. And there's actually companies out there that will help you write your job descriptions to be more inclusive. There's tools that you can use to analyze your language. So start there, right? Are you attracting a broad pool of candidates in the way you're writing your job descriptions? Where are you recruiting? Is there a diverse list of institutions that you go to recruit? Or are you recruiting from the same 5 colleges that everyone else is recruiting from? If you want a diverse workforce, do you recruit at universities that have a representative student population to the population you would like to see in your workforce? If you're in the United States, we have something called historically Black colleges and universities. Are you recruiting there? What about other places to gain early career people? What about alternative programs? Military spouse programs, veterans programs, boot camps. I mentioned Hackbright Academy. There's a number of boot camps for people to develop their skills quickly so they can be part of the workforce. These are return to work programs. These are all places where we can be recruiting that are different from the standard cookie cutter approach. What about our professional networks? So many people who get referred to jobs or get there because they were referred by someone else who worked there. So let's think about this for a minute. If by and large the technology workforce is not diverse and we are all referring people from places we've worked before, by definition, that pool is not going to be very diverse. So look at your own professional network. How widespread is it? Could you broaden it out? What about organizations, professional organizations that we reach out to recruit from? Could those be broadened out? That's all in building the funnel. Now you're interviewing, right? Examine your interview process for bias. Are your hiring panels diverse? If you bring in a female candidate and she interviews with an all-male panel, in the back of her mind, she's wondering if this is the right place for her. You may never know that, and she may never say it, but it is true. What about in the interview itself, the questions, the selection criteria? Shifting criteria is a way that biases turn up in hiring, right? When you get to the point where you're evaluating a candidate and the criteria applied to one person is not the same as the criteria applied to another, and it's often unconscious. Look out for that. And how do you protect against all of this, right? When you measure it, measure your funnel. Who are you bringing in? Who's getting as far as the interview? Who's getting past the first screening? Who's getting the interviews? Who's getting the offers? Does it reflect the kind of workforce that you actually want to hire? And if not, where are the issues? Where are the challenges? All right, now you've hired. What about retaining and advancing people, right? People from underrepresented groups, women. And we talked about all the reasons women leave. So let's look at what it would take to encourage them to stay. Starting with managers. I mean, the truth is managers carry a lot of the water here, right? Everyone knows that your immediate manager has a huge impact on your work experience. Are we giving managers the kind of support and the kind of training that's needed to actually lead a diverse group or a diverse set of employees? When we give out work assignments as a manager, as a technical lead, are we being equitable? Are we ensuring that people are getting opportunities, right? And that we're not relegating people to what they're perceived to be good at in terms of like doing the organizational work or doing the execution work, right? Are we ensuring that our teams that are innovating new products are diverse? Those performance evaluations and that feedback, that's a big place to pay attention to. I mentioned this earlier, that the kind of feedback that women get, and this is a place that you can all hold each other accountable as managers. Some organizations actually have somebody looking out for that in feedback sessions to ensure that feedback is not falling into that trap. We're asking a lot of managers, we ask a lot of managers in general, but this is a very important aspect of success here, is that the managers have to have the toolkit and be supported. Now, we're not all managers, but we all could be mentors and sponsors. And just a moment on the difference here, right? So a mentor is someone who coaches you, who advises you, who talks to you about your work experience and gives you advice. A sponsor is someone who talks about your work to other people, who finds opportunities for you to highlight your work, to present your work. A sponsor is someone who talks you up to others in the organization. And we need both, right? No one gets ahead without both. Now, some companies have formal programs for this, but you can also have informal programs. And anyone participating, joining us here today can be a sponsor or a mentor to someone. Another area we can all help is in those day-to-day dynamics. What sometimes are called micro inequities, which is the getting interrupted frequently in meetings, having your ideas ignored. Common dynamic, I'm sure many people can relate to. A woman makes a suggestion in a meeting, nobody responds. 5 minutes later, a man basically makes the same suggestion. Everyone says, great idea. That kind of stuff happens. So we are all in these meetings. We are all in these design sessions or these code reviews. We can all help to ensure that this kind of thing doesn't happen in our teams. And again, measure all of this, right? Measure your hiring, measure retention, measure your advancement. If you're not measuring these things, you cannot fix them. Every organization can do this. And everyone who's listening, watching today, we can all be part of the solution, right? We all have many roles that we play in these teams. We're colleagues and coworkers. Maybe we're managers or tech leads, and we can influence our immediate teams. We can influence the companies we work for. But doing so requires taking a stand, speaking up, being aware. In those meetings, help out the person who's getting interrupted. Speak up for them. Make space for them to finish their thought. Don't let bad behavior pass. Don't let those sexist or racist jokes pass. Engage in these difficult discussions. This is not all easy stuff, but unless we engage in honest discussion within our organizations, we cannot make change. That's what happened in past, and that is what can happen in every company if we're committed to doing so. But it also takes holding our leaders accountable. Wherever we work, if we do not have leadership support for this, we will not go far. So hold the companies that you work for accountable for diversity and inclusion. Now, I want to invite you all to join tomorrow for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Keynote. Barry Williams will be the speaker, and Barry will be talking about some of the ethical challenges in the technical space today, and how the lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion actually causes or exacerbates those problems. So I hope you'll be able to join. I'm very much looking forward to it myself. I want to take a minute to thank a number of people. The names on this slide are people who have been part of the past WIT leadership over the years. Several of them helped me pull together data for this presentation, which I appreciate very much. I just want to take a moment to recognize some of the folks who have worked tirelessly over the years to ensure that past WIT continues year over year. And for those of you who may be interested in some of the data that I shared with you today, I have links on this slide where you can find all of the source material that I used. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. It's really been an honor and a pleasure to share my perspective with you. Thank you.